Hare Om Namaha. Quote, if there is a bad boy, he can turn the whole family to ashes. Similarly, in this institution, if there is a bad disciple, he can burn the whole institution into ashes, unquote. Well, there were a number of bad boys, weren't there? They did burn the ISKCON institution down with potent assistance from the imprimatur of the vitiated GBC and from the Gaudiya Mutt to do just that. Primarily, who were they? Primarily, they were as follows. Bad boy Satsvarup, the so-called Gurupad. Bad boy Hridayananda, the so-called Acharya Dev. Bad boy Bhavananda, the so-called Vishnupad. Bad boy Bhagavan, the so-called Gurudev, a.k.a. the Sun King. Bad boy Hangsaduta, the so-called Krishna Kirtan Thakur. Bad boy Harikesh, the so-called Vishnupad. Bad boy Jayapataka, the so-called Acharyapad. Bad boy Jayatirtha, the so-called Tirthapad. And bad boy Rameshvara, who, to his marginal credit, did not adopt one of those imitation ridiculous labels. Oh, did I forget anybody? Well, maybe I did. And maybe that was intentional. The 9 bad boys just mentioned all engaged in activities of defiance against Prabhupada's orders, desires, and stated vision for his branch of the Hare Krishna movement of Krishna consciousness. A monthly podcast could easily be dedicated to their malicious exploits. Some were worse than others. But that is not what the podcast for this month will be about. Instead, it is about the other 2 of the 11 great pretenders who were not just mentioned, who individually, what to speak of together, were the taproots of the colossal hoax of 1978 and who arguably did the most damage. Not only for that reason, but for other reasons also. These 2 really bad boys are now both dead and gone. In terms of a life expectancy for transcendentalists engaged in a controlled and austere lifestyle, what it's expected to be, they both died young. One, a lifelong Protestant, even in the Hare Krishna movement, died of extreme renal failure in a Catholic hospital of suburban Bombay. The aftermath, however, of his painful death was particularly gruesome. The other died in the middle of the night, at an inauspicious time, in the middle of nowhere in West Bengal, in a gruesome and violent car crash which literally tore his body in half, although the actual cause of death was a severe blow to the head. Most of you know these 2 men who I'm referring to, and these men and their misdeeds are going to be discussed in this month's episodes. Their names: bad boy Kirtanananda, the so-called Bhaktipad, and bad boy Tamal Krishna, the so-called Gurudev. Henceforward, this second fellow will be referred to as TKG, which is always the case in my podcasts. They were raised differently. Their cultural and ethnic affiliation was different. Their mentalities were very different. Their type and level of charisma was different. Their styles differed. And their level of cooperation together was, for all practical purposes, non-existent. They did, however, both go along with the vitiated GBC plan in the aftermath of Prabhupada's disappearance. Now, from my personal experience, there are only 3 photos of them together. 2 of these were group shots of all 11 pretenders surrounding a large painting of Prabhupada. Most of them, of the 11, were smiling in those photos because by that time, they all knew that they had got over and that no one could stop them. As such, those pictures of the 2 in particular tell us nothing of their interrelationship. Now, but there is one other photo of just these 2 men together, and that one is a picture worth 1,000 words. The tension exhibited between them is quite palpable if you have the eyes to see it. They were deeply suspicious of one another. They were clearly not friendlies. That is why there was a subtle but distinct bifurcation of the movement when the zonal Acharya scam was implemented in the late spring of 1978. These men were the taproots of that massive deviation. Kirtanananda was of Anglo-Saxon ethnicity and a rather extreme version of its accompanying religion. So those of the 11 that had that Abrahamic background subtly aligned with him. 5 others, meaning 5 others and then TKG is the 6th, were born in Talmudic environments, and they naturally aligned with TKG. None of this was an explicit or stated alignment, of course. It was all covert. Only a few of Prabhupada's disciples were able to recognize it. Technically, one of the others, of Italian ethnicity, aligned himself with both men, so he straddled the fence, so to speak. This was all in the short term, however. As the zonal scam broke down, it was everybody for himself as they all had to jump ship. Most of them, virtually all of them, could no longer be worshipped as the gods they weren't. The God-men. For years, they had checked many ambitious godbrothers, but when the levee broke, they had to try to survive the growing backlash that came their way, and it was rather severe. The 2nd and 3rd echelon were in rebellion. In other words, most of the 11 had to acquiesce and allow for the expansion of so-called gurus, because that's all that could expand from that group. Now, as has been the case for months, we herein continue with our series of analyzing, in chronological order, the chapters of 11 Naked Emperors, herein ENE. And this book and these chapters were written by Henry Doktorski, as you know. 11 Naked Emperors, ENE, is his 2nd book of 12, and in the opinion of your host speaker, it's his best one. We have now reached chapter 7, entitled, quote, 2 Architects of Evil, unquote. He is referring here to Kirtanananda and TKG, and accordingly, we shall commit our focus to these 2 taproots of the massive deviation of 1978. Your host speaker is quoted extensively in this chapter 7. That is appreciated. And I do not see any reason why I should not reproduce some of those quotations, even at length if I so choose, and I do so choose. After all, they were put into the book by Doktorski because they made points he wanted to make about these two egregious imitation Mahabhagavats. Subtitled The Cult of Kirtanananda. E&E spends much font space early via Chapter 7 discussing in some detail Kirtanananda's misdeeds and exploits in the early years of the ISKCON movement. We shall not go over all of those. Then E&E presents a quote about Kirtanananda from the leader of the institutional reform movement in the mid-80s, Kirtanananda's chief nemesis. The major change that his nemesis sparked is called by me, accurately, the second transformation or the collegiate compromise. However, in this case, I am in agreement with that nemesis' analysis of Kirtanananda, to wit, quote, "You wouldn't envy somebody unless they also had something you wanted. You love what they have, but somehow or other you want to have it all transferred to you." And that's what was there in Kirtanananda. And Mayavad philosophy can also take this form. Prabhupada mentions in Nectar of Devotion, it can take the form of envy of a spiritual master also. So that was the case. This was the first big crisis with Kirtanananda, unquote. Again, it was his nemesis who made this statement. E&E later quotes a February 1987 letter by the same man to Kirtanananda, quote, "Your position in New Vrindavan mirrors that of Srila Prabhupada in ISKCON with astonishing fidelity. At the same time, there were problems of excess, of overstepping the bounds of propriety. You, along with Hansadutta, were severely rebuked by Srila Prabhupada for attempting Guru Puj. It was an offense to him. He called it, quote, a premature attempt, unquote. It indicates that your relationship to Srila Prabhupada is not entirely on center. That might be a small thing in someone else, but in a person of your stature, it is a disaster," unquote. E&E goes granular into the many deviations of, as the subtitle calls it, the cult of Kirtanananda. This was, of course, before he labeled himself Bhaktipad, quote-unquote Bhaktipad, which was just after Prabhupada's disappearance. E&E discusses how Kirtanananda disobeyed a direct order to open a center in London. Instead, he flew from India directly to New York City, where, linking up with his homosexual buddy Hayagriva, he preached that the devotees there should give up all the trappings of Vaishnavism. This was part of his plan to de-Indianize and westernize the Hare Krishna movement. For this audacity, Prabhupada said that Kirtanananda should be sent back to the asylum, Bellevue, that he came from when he joined, and added, quote, "Kirtanananda may be eager to address in the Harvard University, but recently he has lost his link on account of disobedience," unquote. Chapter 7 describes the reason that devotees began to call him Black Keith. It describes how he attempted to publish Prabhupada's Bhagavad Gita manuscript under his own name, but no publishers believed him when he told them that he was the work's author. E also describes that Kirtanananda began preaching that Prabhupada had empowered him to be the sole devotee to carry on the Hare Krishna movement as Prabhupada's successor. It also mentions that Kirtanananda began chanting Om Namah Shivaya during kirtans. Chapter 7 describes how Kirtanananda printed stationery for an organization he planned to form and incorporate entitled First United Church of Krishna, Youth Organization Underground. In case you didn't notice, its acronym was FUCKYOU. For all of this rascaldom and more, Kirtanananda and Hayagriva were directed by Prabhupada to either return to the temple separately and go into the kitchen to wash dishes, or as an option to go into seclusion. They fittingly chose the latter alternative. And we're not going to get into all of that. If you're interested in those details, purchase E and read Chapter 7 for yourself. In due course, Kirtanananda came back and begged forgiveness with tears in the eyes. Unfortunately for all of us, at least in the long run, Prabhupada granted him that forgiveness with no real penance attached to it. Now, this should not be misinterpreted to mean that I'm criticizing Prabhupada for doing so, as he took many such risks. Some panned out, and some didn't. Once back, Kirtanananda arranged to have some godbrothers and godsisters worship him at his rural Moundsville compound. This deranged devotion was the first seed of what would later become an all-encompassing tyranny of the mind for those inmates of Moundsville. Prabhupada had to once again intervene, and in January of 1975, he gave Kirtanananda a severe scolding in Hawaii, and this was mentioned previously. The idea that Kirtanananda was recognized as Shiksha Guru for newcomers was directly contradicted by Prabhupada during that chastisement session in his quarters. One senior man, a governing body commissioner present there to hear it, reported that Prabhupada told Kirtanananda, quote, "I am both the Diksha Guru and the Shiksha Guru for all of my disciples," unquote. And as an aside, when I was in the movement, I heard that that was the way it was also, and I always agreed with that completely. Perhaps that's why I never got suckered in by the make shows. Kirtanananda threw down the gauntlet just after Prabhupada departed physical manifestation. He did this by initiating new people in late December of 1977 without any approval from or even consultation with the other governing body commissioners. He also began taking opulent worship from his own godbrothers and godsisters in the temple room in front of open deities on an elevated seat at his Moundsville compound. This forced the situation. And E quotes your host speaker concerning that. Quote, Kailasa Chandra commented on Kirtanananda's audacity. Kirtanananda made it clear that he was not going to be relegated to such a Vaidhi Bhakti status, and the others were forced to either imitate him or excommunicate him. They chose the former, unquote. As such, who can deny that the GBC has its fingerprints all over the deviation, especially after it capitulated to Kirtanananda. It allowed all of the other so-called gurus who made the claim based upon being appointed as Ritviks to accept similar worship from god brothers and god sisters and newcomers. It all went down during the implementation stage of the zonal hoax in the late spring of 1978. E&E also quotes your host speaker in this connection. Quote, although the 11 Ritvik priests certainly deserve to be held accountable for their takeover of ISKCON in 1978, the actual responsibility belonged to the GBC. The GBC could have stopped the 11 from taking over, but it did not. Kailasa Chandra noted, quote, if you walk back the cat, in the late 70s, the responsibility for all the current hell in the so-called Krishna consciousness movement falls squarely on the governing body commission. The 11 great pretenders did not actually impose the zonal acharya deviation. It was the GBC that imposed it. The deviation would never even have gotten traction without GBC imprimatur. As the rituals within the movement changed, so did its ideals. The GBC, the vitiated GBC, was benefiting from this descent into the black hole of a shadow society, and it went unchecked. Prabhupada was converted into a figurehead, and new leaders were replacing him. The whole debacle traces back to massive GBC deviation. It traces back to its presumption of dominance that was never a part of the charter authorizing it, unquote. E&E then quotes your host speaker about what should have been done if Kirtanananda and his, as he called them, 10 little Indian boys, had taken a more humble approach and acted as Madhyam Adhikari regular gurus. Please note, they couldn't act as Madhyam Adhikaris because they weren't Madhyams. Anyway, now we go to where I'm quoted here. Quote, almost all of the leading secretaries, and from what I have heard through the grapevine, all of the contingent that would soon become 11 Ritviks, attended that crucial room conversation with Srila Prabhupada on May 28, 1977. All the important GBC men knew that it was crucial, and they all knew that one or two, TKG and Satsvarup were selected, had to broach the difficult and very touchy subject of how initiations were to continue after Srila Prabhupada departed. Srila Prabhupada answered that difficult question, quote, regular guru, that's all. He becomes disciple of my disciple, that's it, unquote. Everything is there. I was the first devotee to comment that the adjective regular refers to the noun regulation. Ravindra responded favorably when I wrote this to him in 1985. But all of those men, Ravindra probably was not in Vrindavan in May 77, all of them should have recognized this correlation as soon as Prabhupada uttered the term regular guru. The Uttama is a liberated acharya, but the Madhyam can still serve in the capacity of a Diksha guru as long as he has received the order to do so from the liberated acharya. Capital A. This is how genuine sannyasis carry on the line. A Madhyam Adhikari is qualified to be a regular guru. As such, he is conversant with the science of God. This stage of the science the existence of a regular guru and the platform which he is thus on, if and or when he becomes a Diksha Guru, it's all part of being conversant in the spiritual science related to the stages of Atmarama. It is not an advanced realization in one sense, because you do not have to be expert in the science, Uttama, to know and realize it fully. If the 11, hypothetically 11, that number's arbitrary, if the 11 had been steady in self-realization, which they weren't, if the 11 had been steady in self-realization, had thus been Madhyamadikaris, which they weren't, and were thus ordered specifically and personally to be regular gurus, they would have only paid a courtesy visit to Swami B.R. Sridhar, nothing more than that. They would have seen immediately the dangerous flaws in his recommendations in so many ways, including, quote-unquote, acharyas of the zone. They would not have adopted any of them. They would have, alternatively and individually, also quite possibly collectively, declared that Prabhupada had recognized them as gurus and ordered them to initiate, which he didn't. His divine grace might well have done that for some or all of them before he departed, if they were qualified, which they weren't. And if they were qualified and so directed, they would not have created zones for initiating disciples. They would have possessed Vaishnava humility, which they didn't. They would have taken the standard lecture seats available at each ISKCON temple, and they would have made disciples by the power of their preaching, which is called personal charisma, not via institutional mandate or institutional charisma. Madhyam Adhikari Diksha Gurus do not compete with one another for disciples and resources, nor do they rely upon governing bodies in order to become approved institutional gurus. They are far beyond these kinds of anarthas. Madhyams are far beyond. Most importantly, they would have made sure that the GBC functioned as a watchdog. In other words, as soon as any initiate of Prabhupada declared that he was now himself initiating disciples and or began initiating disciples, a committee of learned Brahmins would have traveled to his preaching center or centers in order to make sure that he was representing the philosophy and the process in the right way, unquote. However, by jumping the gun, it was Kirtanananda who most effectively prevented anything bona fide from being legislated at the GBC Asatsapa conclave in late March of 1978. Of course, as I've already mentioned, none of the 11 were Madhyams, so that has to be figured into the equation for our judgment. But this man, Kirtanananda, did so much damage, and a great deal of it has proven to be irreversible. Tattvamasi. Kirtanananda was the oldest of the lot. He was personally charismatic, and he had dedicated followers. He misused that for aggrandizement to the detriment of the movement. Of the 11, he was one of the two taproots. It was a dark dyad. These two ambitious architects of the zonal acharya scam were the sources of the conversion of the movement in 1978. And as Prabhupada so aptly put it in one of his letters, quote, "The poison is personal ambition," unquote. Now, let us segue to that other dreadful taproot of the so-called air quotes, ISKCON movement of the late 70s. Kirtanananda was obviously loaded with personal ambition, but there was another leader who was arguably even more ambitious. And that is, of course, the Machiavellian manipulator. So-called ISKCON pseudo-spiritual creeper, an imitation weed, eventually strangled the real creeper. It did so via its leaders, which benefited from that strangulation. It had 11 prominent leaders in the late 70s, and those were, of course, the great pretender's own acharyas. And it had one prominent leader in the mid-80s when the second transformation was ushered in, which solved nothing. It has a different set of leaders now. The coin of its realm has always been and continues to be narcissism. All 11 of those pretender Mahabhagavats were narcissists, but 2 of them were mega narcissists. Those 2 are discussed prominently in Chapter 7 of E&E. That narcissistic coin of the air quotes ISKCON realm had 2 sides: personal charisma and institutional charisma, the latter being the charisma of the party man. Personally, I did not find Kirtanananda attractive whatsoever. He repulsed me. His Neanderthal lectures were delivered to simply grind down the audience via his patented, quote-unquote, we know nothing tactic. His face was ugly, and when smiling, it revealed horrific teeth. Nevertheless, I can understand why hundreds of devotees were enthralled by him, because he did have personal charisma. He took the air out of the room when he entered it, and that was always by design, combined with his mega narcissism. He was clearly, and for all practical purposes totally, on that side of the coin of so-called ISKCON, the one which is represented by personal charisma. And then we come to TKG. He was on the opposite side of the coin. This should not be misinterpreted to mean that he was not self-centered. He was just as self-centered as any of the Ocean's 11. However, he utilized a manipulative expertise combined with institutional representation in order to coerce devotees to bend to his influence. He considered himself to be the moon of Prabhupada's movement. He was already angling, like some of the other 11, to become the successor in the Hare Krishna movement even before Prabhupada departed physical manifestation. E&E describes it as follows, quote, actually, Tamal Krishna had a long history of wanting to be Prabhupada's successor, years even before Prabhupada passed away. Narayan Das Vishwakarma was initiated in San Francisco in September 1968 and knew Tamal Krishna, who was initiated in August of 1968 from the early days of the movement. Narayan described Tamal Krishna's all-consuming manic fervor to become Prabhupada's successor. And here's a quote from Narayan. I knew, quote, I knew Tamal extremely well from the very early days of the movement onward. From the very beginning, he wanted to be Srila Prabhupada's only guru successor. Tamal took me aside in 1969 and said, quote, Srila Prabhupada has said that there are many stars, but I want a moon, unquote. Tamal said to me, with manic fervor, I am that moon. The problem is that Srila Prabhupada never recognized Tamal as any sort of moon. and Tamal could not reconcile his own self-perception with the idea that Srila Prabhupada certainly did not see him as his sole successor as Acharya after Srila Prabhupada, unquote. So we're going to skip a little history here and we'll go on. TKG was eventually given sannyas and a GBC post in India. Previous to that, he had proven himself in the short term by effectively organizing magazine collection and distribution in California. He was appointed to that GBC post in Bharatavarsha, but he did not endear himself to the other leaders already established there. He wanted to completely control them. But this was not within the jurisdiction of his power or his assignment. As a GBC, he was simply to oversee, witness, and report. But that's not how he played it out, and that was not how it was playing out. He especially alienated a couple of sannyasis, itinerant preachers, and even more than them, the president of the Bombay Center. Quote, this is a quote from Prabhupada, by the way. GBC does not mean to control a center. GBC means to see that the activities of a center go on nicely. I do not know why Tamal is exercising his absolute authority. That is not the business of GBC. The president, treasurer, and secretary are responsible for managing the center. GBC is to see that things are going nicely, but not to exert absolute authority. That is not in the power of GBC. Tamal should not do like that. The GBC men cannot impose anything on the men of a center without consulting all of the other GBC members first. A GBC member cannot go beyond the jurisdiction of his power, unquote. Your host speaker had no dealings with the so-called Bhaktipad, either before or after he adopted that concocted label. I did have some direct and indirect contact with TKG, however. Not very much, and none of it went well. I did not like him. He picked up on that, and even previous to doing so, he was wary of me. He called me, quote-unquote, very intelligent, but that was as far as anything favorable was spoken or acted upon by him in relation to me. He certainly disliked me, and intrigue and treachery were part of that mix. I shall not get into all of it, because for one reason, there really was not that much of it. But I shall share a few nasty nuggets with you here. I briefly spoke with him and his chief loyal lieutenant at Govinda's Honolulu restaurant sometime either in late 1979 or early 1976. My synapses don't remember the date. That brief meeting at his dining table was full of tension, very unpleasant, but just a taste of what was to come. He harassed me while Prabhupada was giving a platform lecture after the Janmashtami parade down Fifth Avenue in New York City, and he singled me out while subtly doing so. In early 1977, he linked up with Comrade Jayatirtha, knowing of the man's deviations, and by this I'm referring to the sannyasi they corralled. They both corralled a sannyasi I was working under with the leverage of knowledge of his deviations, of his theft and his intoxication, in order to force him to jettison me from his party. I had led it successfully, very successfully, but I had gotten under Jayatirtha's skin while doing so in England. As such, I got bushwhacked in India. I learned about this betrayal that had me summarily dismissed by that clown sannyasi later through the grapevine. It caused me severe distress at the time and an accompanying illness, so much so that I barely had enough strength to get on the airplane to leave India. When TKG wanted to make your life miserable, he found a way to do so. That ominous black birthmark near his temple was not there for nothing, let me tell you. If you were in a lower echelon and did not admire him to his satisfaction, he made sure that you paid for it. Another irritable thing about him. It seemed like every second sentence he uttered what began with the words, "You should." You should do this. You should do that. He wanted to control everyone he met, at least all those who were not part of his upper echelon. Another anecdote. This one you'll find interesting. In the late spring of 1979, I introduced a pet disciple of Prabhupada's, a sannyasi at that time, to Mitralal Gupta in a suburb of Varanasi. This elderly Hindu was the most famous and expert palmist in India. I have something I could say about him, but I promised I wouldn't, but he was very, very prominent, to say the least. The three of us were talking in the foyer of his opulent house there, and the sannyasi I was with wanted to show him a picture of Prabhupada. As Providence would have it, that sannyasi had a BTG with a color photo, more or less a double headshot of Prabhupada with TKG next, and they were next to one another. Oh! He showed the picture to Gupta. The palmist's head snapped back as soon as he saw it. He was aghast. There was a moment of hesitation, then Mitralal said, quote, "How could your guru associate with such a demoniac man?" unquote. As a side note, TKG's black birthmark was prominent in that picture. Now, let us see what Chapter 7 offers us in terms of information, factoids, and knowledge of and about the Machiavellian manipulator. Quote, "Is it possible that Tamal Krishna's unfilled ambition to become Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada's successor became such a heavy psychological burden that it eventually manifested itself in emotional angst, anger, and ultimate madness? As Karanthar indicated to Amayatma, quote, Tamal Krishna is mad, unquote. In a candid moment of honest self-reflection 2 years later, Tamal Krishna himself admitted, quote, "When I was temple president in Los Angeles, I used to beat the hell out of people. That's why I was the king of the heap there," unquote. Please note, this is but another example of Doktorski's granular research, which reveals information that without his great effort, only a handful of devotees would come to know about it. As we move toward the end of Chapter 7, E&E discusses the poison issue, and TKG's being in the center of that controversy. There is substantial evidence that Prabhupada was indeed poisoned by an inner coterie of his leading men and their sycophants. Indeed, there's a smoking gun even, which was his statement made just a month before he departed, quote, "Someone has poisoned me," unquote. Now, as most of you know, I'm against Ritvik. It has, in most of its presentations, aligned itself with the poison issue. And it has done so in many of those cases by comparing Jesus Christos with Prabhupada. Also, please note that I do believe Prabhupada was poisoned and that TKG was integral to that diabolical act. However, I intentionally avoid getting deep into this issue, although, please note, I've studied all of the evidence and arguments in excruciating detail. I was amongst the first to purchase Nityananda's book when it came out in the mid-90s, or late 90s, whenever that was. But I tend to avoid the controversy because Ritvik has attached the crucifixion to the poisoning, which is outrageous. So we're going to skip all of that, and we shall move on to later entries in E&E. Quote, Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada's leading disciples, in no small measure due to Tamal Krishna himself, disobeyed their spiritual master's orders, and within a few short years, chaos erupted within ISKCON and threatened to split the society. In hindsight, it appears that Tamal Krishna, perhaps in collaboration with Kirtanananda Swami, as evidenced by Tamal Krishna's 1978 conversation with Gauridas Pandit in Vrindavan mentioned earlier, it appears that Tamal Krishna masterminded the conspiracy to 1. Suppress Prabhupada's discussions regarding the installation of regular gurus in ISKCON, and 2. Promote the erroneous idea that Prabhupada had appointed 11 men to become Uttama Adhikari Diksha Guru zonal acharyas after his passing, unquote. There might have been some collaboration between TKG and Kirtanananda, but I seriously doubt it. As far as Gauridas is concerned, to a significant degree he brought in the Ritvik heresy. As such, no one should take anything he says seriously. What has just been quoted encapsulates the devastating influence of TKG on the Hare Krishna movement. That diabolical man planned the whole thing. He was able to manifest his self-serving ambitions through the deviation he engineered, beginning with the letter appointing the 11 Ritviks. However, as Hansaduta said to me on the front porch of Mount Kailas in Lake County, California in early 1988, quote, we went way too far and we couldn't pull it off, unquote. An honest perspective. And by the way, and for the record, Hansaduta was utterly contemptuous of TKG and considered him a complete phony. No disagreement here from me, be assured. Now we'll go to another quote from E&E. Quote, most of the 11 may have been unaware of Tamal Krishna Goswami's deception, which he apparently kept only to himself. The other Ritviks might have actually believed that Prabhupada had appointed them to serve as Uttama Adhikari Diksha Gurus after his passing. We should note, however, that none of the 11 refused their so-called appointments as Uttama Adhikari Diksha Guru zonal acharyas. But thinking that they had, by the grace of Krishna and Prabhupada, advanced to the perfect stage of Uttama Adhikari, was that not far-fetched? Now, this is not in the teleprompter text, but I need to explain this a little bit here, what Doktorski is getting to. There's a number of points that need to be touched upon. What he's saying, that TKG had a deception that Prabhupada appointed the Ritviks to become gurus after Prabhupada disappeared. So, as we all know how the transitive connection went, from Ritvik to Diksha Guru to Zonal Acharya to successor for all 11 of them. All bogus, of course, except the fact that they were appointed Ritviks in the beginning in July of 77. So what he's saying here is that the other Ritviks besides TKG, and you can't include Kirtanananda in this because he was already imitating Uttama Adhikari by December 77. But he said, Doktorski is saying that the other 10 then, or it would be 9, believed that Prabhupada had appointed them to serve as Uttama Adhikari Diksha Gurus based on the influence of TKG. It didn't start like that. It went to that, but it didn't start like that. It started as the Ritvik becomes a guru when the spiritual master departs. Ritvik Acharya, then it becomes as good as Acharya, as B.R. Sridhar said. So what Doktorski is saying here, however, we should note that none of the 11 refused their so-called appointments. This is true. It's a true statement, of course, but I'm not saying the statement is ridiculous. I'm saying the mentality that it indicates is ridiculous. Because every one of them knew they weren't anywhere near that. They were light years away from even being Madhyams. They all knew in the beginning that they weren't anywhere near Uttama. Now, to give an analogy here, and it's a very fitting analogy, by the way, at a certain stage, you become, if you take heroin, a heroin addict, and it's a sickness and you're helpless at a certain stage. I agree with that, but that stage isn't when you first make the first injection. You're fully responsible. You know what you're doing, and you're doing it anyway. These men knew that they weren't gurus, and they knew that they weren't uttamas, and they knew that they weren't successors. Now, afterwards, if they're so addicted to what they're getting worshipped by their god brothers and their god sisters with the big tits dancing in front of them while they're sitting on their vyasasan, all right, they could become addicted to that, yeah. But not in the beginning. They knew that they had not advanced to the perfect stage of Uttamadhikari because they hadn't even reached the preliminary stage of perfection at Madhyam. So, in a sense, I'm not saying it's a flaw. There's nothing in Doktorski's statement here that I just quoted that's false. All of it's true. But you have to understand where all those men were at, and then the needle in and the damage done. All of Ocean's 11 were bad boys. However, without the influence of Kirtanananda and TKG, the zonal acharya scam might not have gone down. Remember, they jumped from Ritviks, then to Diksha Gurus, then to Uttamas, and then to successors in a very short span of time, almost immediately. It was outrageous. But Kirtanananda set the tone, and TKG provided the explanation which satisfied the party men, and they had to be satisfied because they were in the majority at the lower echelons. With the help of Swami B.R. Sridhar, virtually everyone in the movement was bamboozled by the whole thing. The other 9 could not have even attempted such a devastating scam without the leadership provided by the 2 taproots of tyranny. They were the baddest of the bad boys. And Prabhupada's movement was thrown into an irreversible descent, into one deviated transformation after another. And one final anecdote will now be shared. Your hair may stand on end after you hear this one. Your skin may crawl. In January of 1978, on my 27th birthday, I had an intense discussion with the GBC for the Southeast Zone of America. It took place just outside the office he had bestowed upon me, although I also slept there, the office in the building at the top of the Ponce de Leon complex in Atlanta. The discussion centered around the intrigue, treachery, and betrayal that I had undergone at the hands of one of the temple presidents in his zone. What I had undergone and how I had very effectively responded to it had led me to be gifted that private office by my GBC, who also lived in that complex, but not in that building. What I'm going to reveal here should not be misinterpreted. This is important, I'm going to repeat it. What I'm going to reveal here should not be misinterpreted to be any kind of knock against that GBC. Of the ISKCON leaders, he was by far the most favorable to me. We're not close, but I'm grateful to him, and I still have a mild liking for him. Basically, in this private talk that January day, he was trying to persuade me to move towards some kind of realization that he believed I should graduate to in terms of how the movement was run. He was one of its top echelon leaders, so he should have known. Prabhupada had even predicted that he would become president of America one day. Like myself, and we were the exceptions to the rule, like myself, he was not willing to worship any of the zonal acharyas, which made him and I exceptions to the rule, most definitely. The statement he made to me on that memorable day is seared into my brain. It cannot be forgotten under any circumstances. I shall now share it with you word for word, advising you again not to whatsoever assimilate it as a judgment of that commissioner, but rather as to the dreadful influence of TKG. And here was the statement that was made to me. Quote, "This movement is run Machiavellian. Tamal Krishna introduced it, and Prabhupada approved it." Unquote. In conclusion, I found one minor discrepancy in Chapter 7. However, it was only mentioned as a suggestion and not as a factual. As such, it deserves to be dismissed. Chapter 7 is flawless. It deserves an A+, and that is the grade that I give to it. The colossal hoax, known as the fabricated so-called ISKCON Confederation, is a pseudo-spiritual scam. It did not just happen. It was made to happen. And the two taproots of tyranny were its chief formulators. They will be mentioned briefly as footnotes in the coming anthology of this movement many decades from now. They will not be mentioned at all favorably, be assured. The era of the bad boys, the zonal acharya epoch, lasted for less than a decade. It was the first transformation, and it was a horror show. It was completely unauthorized. It was replaced by a kinder and gentler, but nevertheless just as deviated second transformation. We are now past that one also, but we are not past the root deviations that were and remain the foundation of the original hoax. And those two rascals, dead as doornails, Kirtanananda and TKG, were integral to concocting that hoax and permanently placing it at the foundation of a Sahaja movement built on sand. Sadeva Samya.